Some folks say a man can lose everything and still find his way back. But Jack Sullivan had buried that hope along with his wife Sarah 20 winters ago. The harsh Montana wind cut through his worn leather jacket as he stood outside the rundown motel, whiskey bottle dangling from his calloused fingers. Another town, another temporary job, another night trying to drown memories that refused to stay submerged. Jack was 53, though his weathered face and gray-streaked beard made him look older. His broad shoulders still carried the posture of military discipline, a remnant from his years in special forces that not even 2 decades of drifting could erase. The nightmares from his final deployment had faded to occasional visitations, but the empty space beside him in bed never got smaller. He took another pull from the bottle, letting the whiskey burn down his throat. The pain was an old friend now, constant and reliable in a way that people never were. Behind him, the neon vacancy sign flickered, casting sickly red shadows across the cracked asphalt. Tomorrow he'd move on. Another town, another odd job, another temporary existence. 20 years since Sarah's death. 20 years of running from memories that chased him across state lines and through countless motel rooms just like this one. Sometimes he wondered what she would think of the man he had become, this hollow shell drifting through life without purpose or direction. She'd be disappointed, he knew. Sarah had always believed he was meant for more. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee rings. Jack held it between scarred fingers, reading the lawyer's words for the third time while his coffee grew cold in the diner booth. His brother Connor was dead, and somehow that felt like losing someone he'd already buried years ago. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. Not since that Christmas, when heated words about politics escalated into shouting about deeper wounds, about the choices Jack had made after Sarah's death, about Connor's disappearance when their parents were dying. Brothers who had once been inseparable, reduced to strangers with shared blood and too much pride. The inheritance consisted of a cabin in Whisper Ridge, wherever the hell that was, and one dog, elderly, answering to the name Scout. The lawyer's note mentioned the property sat 47 miles northeast of Milford, accessible only by logging road, and came with 17 acres of pine forest that hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. Jack twisted the thin gold band on his ring finger, a habit that had persisted through 20 years of widowhood. Sarah would have known what to do about Connor, about the cabin, about the dog. She'd always been the one who could make sense of family complications, who could bridge the gap between two stubborn brothers who couldn't seem to occupy the same room without tension thick enough to cut. But Sarah was buried in Riverside Cemetery, and Jack was sitting alone in a truck stop diner, staring at his last connection to family he'd tried to forget. He almost crumpled the letter and tossed it away, almost ordered another coffee, and continued his journey to nowhere in particular. But something stopped him. Perhaps the memory of two boys building forts in the woods behind their childhood home, or perhaps just the strange specificity of a brother leaving him a dog. The waitress refilled his cup without asking. "You look like you got bad news, honey." Jack folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "My brother died." "I'm sorry to hear that." Her voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd heard 1,000 sad stories from strangers passing through. "Were you close?" "Not for a long time." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Family's complicated." Jack left a generous tip on the table and walked out into the crisp morning air. His truck sat alone in the parking lot, loaded with the few possessions he hadn't abandoned over the years. Clothes, tools, a small collection of paperbacks, and a single photo of Sarah in a frame that had seen better days. He'd been heading west, no particular destination in mind. Now, for the first time in years, he had somewhere specific to be. The drive to Whisper Ridge took him through country that grew wilder with each passing mile. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that wound between towering pines and granite outcroppings. The deeper he drove into the mountains, the more the world seemed to close in around him. Cell phone towers disappeared behind ridgeline silhouettes. Road signs became scarce, then vanished altogether. When he finally found the turnoff, marked only by a weathered post with Sullivan carved into sun-bleached wood, Jack felt something shift in his chest. This was real. Connor had been real. Had lived in this place, had died here alone. The cabin sat in a clearing that might have been beautiful once. Now it looked like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. Windows boarded with mismatched planks, a roof that sagged under the weight of fallen branches, and a porch that had surrendered to gravity on one side. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and what had once been a garden was now a tangle of wild growth reclaiming its territory. Jack parked his truck beside a cord of split wood that looked fresh despite being covered in pine needles. Someone had been working here recently. Connor, he supposed, though his brother had never been much for physical labor when they were young. The front door stood ajar, hanging from hinges that protested with rusty squeaks when Jack pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Pine sap and old coffee, leather and something medicinal he couldn't identify. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that stabbed through gaps in the boarded windows, and every footstep echoed in the emptiness. The cabin was larger inside than it appeared from the road. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall. A narrow staircase led to what must be a sleeping loft. Furniture sat under canvas drop cloths like sleeping ghosts, and books lined shelves built into every available wall space. It was the books that made Jack pause. Connor had been a reader in childhood, always disappearing with some adventure story while Jack practiced with their father's rifles or helped with farm chores. But these weren't adventure stories. These were serious volumes: history, philosophy, natural science, military strategy, engineering texts, books that suggested a mind searching for answers to questions Jack couldn't imagine. He pulled one from the shelf at random, a dense volume on cryptography, and found the margins filled with Connor's neat handwriting. Notes, cross-references, mathematical formulas that meant nothing to Jack. He replaced it and examined another, this one on wilderness survival. Again, annotations filled the margins, suggesting not just casual reading, but intense study. On the mantel above the fireplace, he found a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Connor, looking older than Jack remembered, standing beside a large golden retriever in front of this same cabin. Both man and dog were smiling, if dogs could smile, and Connor had his hand resting on the animal's head with obvious affection. "Scout," Jack said to the empty room, and as if summoned by his name, a low whine came from somewhere behind the cabin. He found the dog lying in the shade of an old apple tree, watching him with intelligent, brown eyes that seemed to hold reservations about this new human. Scout was old. That much was obvious. His golden coat had gone white around the muzzle, and when he stood to greet Jack, his hindquarters moved with the careful deliberation of arthritic joints. But there was something else in those eyes, something that reminded Jack of soldiers he'd known. Men who had seen too much and carried it quietly, without complaint. The dog approached slowly, sniffed Jack's offered hand, then sat back on his haunches and studied him with what could only be described as judgment. "So you're my inheritance too, are you?" Jack asked. Scout's tail thumped once against the ground, as if acknowledging the complexity of their situation. The dog was thin, too thin, and Jack realized Connor must have been sick for some time before the end. In the cabin's kitchen, he found bags of dog food and medicine bottles with Scout's name on veterinary labels. Heart medication, arthritis pills, something for seizures. Connor had been taking care of this animal with the dedication of a man who had little else to care for. Jack filled a bowl with water and placed it near the dog. Scout watched him, still wary, but thirsty enough to approach when Jack stepped away. While the dog drank, Jack continued exploring the cabin, pulling back drop cloths to reveal sturdy, handcrafted furniture. Connor had always been good with his hands, and these pieces showed skill developed over years of careful work. The kitchen cabinets held basic supplies: canned goods, rice, beans, coffee, everything organized with almost military precision. In the refrigerator, Jack found beer and condiments, but little else. The bathroom cabinet contained prescription bottles with Connor's name, heart medication similar to Scout's, pain relievers, sleeping pills. The last prescription had been filled just 2 weeks before, according to the date on the label. That first night, Jack slept on Connor's couch with Scout lying nearby, close enough to touch but maintaining a careful distance. The dog didn't fully trust him yet, but seemed willing to accept his presence as long as he didn't make any sudden moves or his demands. As darkness settled over Whisper Ridge, bringing with it sounds Jack hadn't heard in decades, owl calls and the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth, he found himself thinking about the paths that had led both brothers to this place. Connor, isolated and scholarly, caring for an aging dog in a cabin surrounded by wilderness. Himself drifting through years of odd jobs and temporary apartments, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. In the morning, he would need to decide what to do with this inheritance. The practical choice would be to sell everything, find a home for the own, and continue his aimless journey toward whatever end awaited him. But lying there in the darkness, listening to Scout's steady breathing and the wind in the pines, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Against the far wall, partially hidden behind a bookshelf, he noticed something that made him sit up. A walking stick carved from what looked like mountain ash leaned against the logs. The handle was worn smooth from use, and intricate designs ran the length of the shaft. Birds and leaves and symbols that seemed to tell a story Jack couldn't read. It was beautiful work, the kind of careful craftsmanship that took patience and skill. Connor had always been good with his hands, but this suggested years of practice, of long evenings spent shaping wood while Scout lay at his feet and the fire crackled in the grate. Jack reached for the stick, then stopped. Some things, he realized, were meant to be approached slowly, with respect for the man who had made them and the solitude they represented. Connor had carved this walking stick in a place where no one would see it or admire his skill. He had made it for the simple pleasure of creation, for the meditation of working with his hands, while his mind wrestled with whatever demons had driven him to this remote hollow. Tomorrow, Jack would explore more of the cabin and its surroundings. He would learn about his brother's life in this place and figure out what to do with the responsibility that had fallen to him. But tonight, he was content to lie still and listen to the sound of Scout's breathing, feeling less alone than he had in longer than he could remember. 3 days into his stay at the cabin, Jack had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. He rose with the sun, made coffee on Connor's wood-burning stove, and spent his mornings exploring the property while Scout limped along at his own pace. The dog had warmed to him gradually, accepting food from his hand and even allowing the occasional scratch behind the ears. Jack had been surprised at how well-maintained the infrastructure of the property was, despite the cabin's outward appearance of neglect. The roof didn't leak. The plumbing worked. The generator started on the first pull. Connor had obviously invested time and resources in practical matters while letting aesthetics slide. The more Jack explored, the more he realized the property had been designed with security and self-sufficiency in mind. A vegetable garden, now overgrown but still productive, sat in a sunny clearing. A root cellar beneath the cabin contained preserves and dried goods sufficient to last months. The creek that ran along the eastern border of the property had been partially diverted to create a small pond stocked with trout. Solar panels, carefully concealed among the trees, supplemented the generator's power. His brother hadn't just been living here, he'd been preparing for something. On the third afternoon, while clearing fallen branches from the path to the creek, Jack discovered a small shed tucked away behind a stand of aspens. Unlike the cabin, the shed was in perfect condition, its wood freshly stained, its doors secured with a heavy padlock. The contrast was striking enough to make him curious. The key hung on a nail inside the kitchen cabinet, easy to find if you knew where to look. Jack hesitated before using it, feeling like an intruder in his brother's private space. But he was here to settle Connor's affairs, which meant understanding what those affairs had been. The shed's interior was immaculate and organized with military precision. Tools hung on a pegboard wall, each outlined in markers so its absence would be immediately apparent. A workbench ran the length of one wall, its surface clean enough to eat from. Shelves held supplies, canned goods, first aid equipment, batteries, ammunition, all neatly labeled and arranged by expiration date. It was the far corner of the shed that made Jack's breath catch. A gun safe stood there, massive and industrial grade. Beside it hung a framed shadow box containing military decorations. A silver star, 2 bronze stars with V devices for valor, a purple heart with oak leaf clusters. Connor Sullivan, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Rangers. The shadow box included a photograph Jack had never seen. Connor in desert camouflage, much younger, surrounded by men with hard eyes and easy grins. Behind them, mountains rose harsh against an Afghan sky. Jack stared at the decorations, unable to reconcile this information with the brother he'd known. Connor had enlisted right out of high school, that much Jack knew, but he'd never mentioned combat deployments or medals for valor, had never spoken of his time in service at all. By the time Jack joined up years later, Connor was already back in civilian life, working in some financial institution in Denver that he rarely discussed. The brothers had lived parallel lives without ever knowing it. Both warriors, both carrying secrets they couldn't share. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so damn tragic. Using the key he found hanging beside the shadow box, Jack opened the gun safe. Inside, he found weapons. A Remington 700 rifle with tactical scope, a Mossberg shotgun, 2 Glock handguns, all immaculately maintained. Boxes of ammunition sat stacked on the bottom shelf. Everything was clean, oiled, ready for use. These weren't hunting weapons kept for sport. They were tools maintained by someone who understood their purpose intimately. A small leather notebook tucked between boxes of ammunition caught Jack's attention. He flipped it open to find firing logs, ballistic calculations, and maintenance records for each weapon. Connor had been shooting regularly, keeping his skills sharp despite his isolation. The last entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. Jack closed the safe and returned to the cabin, his mind racing with questions. Who had his brother really been? Why had a decorated war hero chosen to hide himself away in these remote mountains? And what had he been preparing for with such methodical precision? That evening, Jack explored the cabin more thoroughly, seeing it with new eyes. What he had initially taken for a scholar's retreat now revealed itself as something more complex. The strategic placement of furniture that allowed clear sight lines to all entrances. The reinforced door frames. The subtle marks on windowsills that had suggested sensors or alarms had once been installed. His brother hadn't just been living here, he'd been hiding. The sound of tires on gravel snapped Jack from his thoughts. Scout's ears perked up, but the dog showed no alarm, just recognition. A vehicle was approaching, the first visitor since Jack's arrival. Through the gap in the boarded windows, he watched a sheriff's department SUV park beside his truck. A woman emerged, adjusting her hat as she surveyed the property. Mid-40s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she moved with the confident posture of someone comfortable with authority. Scout had risen to his feet, tail wagging in greeting. The dog clearly knew the visitor, which eased Jack's instinctive wariness. Still, old habits died hard. He positioned himself with a clearer view of the door while keeping most of his body shielded by the kitchen counter. The knock, when it came, was firm and professional. "Mr. Sullivan, Sheriff Rachel Morgan. I heard you'd come up to settle Connor's affairs." Jack opened the door, taking her measure with the automatic assessment he'd never quite lost after leaving the service. The sheriff stood about 5'8", fit but not athletic, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform was crisp, her stance relaxed but ready. She carried herself like someone who'd seen action, though whether in military or law enforcement, he couldn't tell. "That's right," he replied, opening the door wider. "Just trying to figure out what to do with the place." Sheriff Morgan knelt to greet Scout, who accepted her affection with obvious familiarity. "Hey there, old boy. You doing okay with your new person?" The easy way she interacted with the Pui suggested she'd been here before, probably more than once. "Connor was a good neighbor," she said, though her tone carried subtle reservations. "Quiet, kept to himself mostly. We'll miss having him around." She stood, dusting dog hair from her uniform pants. "I was actually hoping to ask you a few questions about your brother. Nothing urgent, just some loose ends I'm trying to tie up." Jack's pulse quickened, but he nodded calmly. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" Inside the cabin, Morgan's eyes took in everything with professional thoroughness. She noted the books, the covered furniture, the general state of careful maintenance that suggested Connor had been a meticulous man. "Connor called the department a few times over the past year," she said, accepting a mug of coffee. "Said he'd been seeing strangers around the property, people who didn't belong. Claimed they were asking questions in town about him." The coffee cup felt slippery in Jack's hands. "What kind of questions?" Oh, the usual things people ask when they're trying to find someone who doesn't want to be found. How long had he lived here? Did he have family? That sort of thing. Morgan's eyes met his directly. Connor seemed to think these folks might have ulterior motives. Jack chose his words carefully. Did you ever see anyone suspicious yourself? A few times, city types driving expensive cars that weren't made for mountain roads. They'd come through town, ask their questions, then disappear for months. But they always came back eventually. She paused, sipping her coffee while studying his reaction. Connor never told me why these people might be looking for him, but he was genuinely frightened. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure Scout was taken care of. The implication hung in the air between them. Morgan suspected there was more to Connor's story than a simple hermit's paranoia, and she was wondering how much Jack knew about his brother's secrets. I wish I could help, Jack said truthfully. Connor and I weren't close. I hadn't seen him in over 15 years before he died. Family quarrel? Something like that. Jack wasn't ready to discuss the complex resentments that had driven the brothers apart, especially not with a law enforcement officer who might already suspect Connor of something. Morgan finished her coffee and stood to leave, but her departure felt more like a tactical retreat than a conclusion. If you remember anything that might explain why people were looking for Connor, I hope you'll let me know. Those strangers haven't been around since the funeral, but that doesn't mean they won't be back. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. One more thing. Connor's death wasn't as straightforward as you might have been told. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. I was told it was heart failure. That's what the death certificate says, but I found him, Mr. Sullivan. I was doing a wellness check after he missed an appointment in town. Her expression darkened. The cabin had been searched, thoroughly. Someone was looking for something, and they didn't care if they tore the place apart to find it. Did they find what they were looking for? Morgan shook her head. I don't know, but whatever Connor was hiding from, I don't think it died with him. She handed Jack a business card. Call me if you notice anything unusual, day or night. After she left, Jack found himself pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Morgan's visit confirmed his suspicions that Connor's isolated life hadn't been merely a preference for solitude. His brother had been running from something or someone, dangerous enough to make a hardened combat veteran retreat to the mountains and live in a state of constant vigilance. Jack spent the rest of the day systematically searching the cabin, looking for any sign of what Connor might have been hiding. He found little beyond what he'd already discovered: the books, the weapons, the carefully maintained infrastructure of survival. If his brother had kept records or journals explaining his situation, they weren't immediately apparent. As evening approached, Jack made a simple dinner of canned stew and bread, sharing bits of meat with Scout, who had taken to following him from room to room as if keeping watch. The dog's behavior had changed subtly since Morgan's visit. More alert, more vigilant, as if her presence had triggered some protective instinct trained into him long ago. That night, as shadows lengthened across the clearing, Scout's behavior changed dramatically. The Heartland dog, normally content to doze by the fireplace, began pacing from window to window, occasionally stopping to stare into the darkening forest with unusual intensity. His low whines carried a note of warning that made Jack's skin crawl. When full darkness fell, Jack turned off all the lights and sat in Connor's chair by the front window, watching the forest for any sign of movement. Scout lay at his feet, alert and tense, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds Jack couldn't hear. Around midnight, he saw them, brief flashes of light moving through the trees, too deliberate to be natural phenomena. Flashlights, carried by people who were trying to approach the cabin without being seen. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his hip, seeking a weapon that wasn't there. He'd been out of the military for decades, but some instincts never fully disappeared. Right now, those instincts were screaming danger. Moving silently through the darkened cabin, he retrieved the Glock from Connor's gun safe. Checking the magazine and chambering around with practiced efficiency. The weight of the weapon in his hand brought a flood of memories. Afghanistan, Iraq, places where shadows in the night meant imminent threat. He pushed the memories away, focusing on the present danger. The lights disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Jack staring into impenetrable darkness while his heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Scout remained rigid with attention, his ears pricked forward and his breathing shallow. They waited through the long hours until dawn, but no one approached the cabin. When morning light finally filtered through the boarded windows, Jack found himself exhausted and jumpy, starting at every creak of settling wood and rustle of windblown leaves. He needed answers, and he suspected Connor had left more clues than just the military decorations. After feeding Scout and forcing himself to eat something, Jack began a systematic search of the cabin, looking for anything his brother might have hidden. In a wooden crate beneath the kitchen sink, he found what he was looking for: a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Connor's careful handwriting. The entries began 3 years ago and continued almost until his death, chronicling a man's struggle with conscience and fear in equal measure. The first entry made Jack's blood run cold. "They found me again today, 3 of them this time, asking old Peterson at the general store if he knew where the Sullivan place was. Peterson's too smart to give strangers directions to isolated cabins, but they'll figure it out eventually. They always do. I never should have taken Reynolds' deal. 25 years, and I still wake up seeing Daniel Hayes' face when that gun went off. But Reynolds made it sound so simple. Inside information, clean getaway. Nobody gets hurt. He lied about everything else, so why did I believe that part? Scout knows something's wrong. Dogs always know." Jack flipped through more pages, piecing together a story that made his stomach churn. Connor hadn't been a willing participant in some unnamed crime. He'd been coerced into providing inside information about armored car routes by Victor Reynolds, a man with connections to organized crime who had discovered Connor's gambling debts and threatened to hurt their elderly parents if he didn't cooperate. But whatever it was had gone wrong from the start. What was supposed to be a simple theft had turned violent when one of the guards drew his weapon. In the chaos that followed, 2 guards died, and Connor had watched it happen, trapped by circumstances he'd never intended to create. The journal revealed that Connor had taken his share of the money, not out of greed but out of fear. Reynolds had insisted that keeping quiet was worth more than talking to the FBI. But instead of spending it, Connor had hidden the money and disappeared into the mountains, hoping distance and time would let him escape the consequences of that terrible day. Another entry dated just 6 months ago detailed a close call. "Reynolds' people were at the cabin last night. I saw their lights through the trees, heard them talking outside. They think I'm holding out on them, that I know where the rest of the money is hidden. They don't understand that this was always about fear, not greed. If they find the strong box, they'll kill me for sure. Not because of the money, that's meaningless to them now. They'll kill me because I know their names, their faces, their methods. I'm the only witness left who can connect them to Hayes and Miller. I need to make arrangements for Scout. If something happens to me, he shouldn't suffer for my mistakes." The final entries were increasingly paranoid and fragmented, describing shadowy figures watching from the forest and unfamiliar vehicles on the logging roads. Connor had known his time was running out, but he'd also been planning for this possibility. In a sealed envelope tucked between the journal's back pages, Jack found a letter addressed to him. "Brother, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found my journal. I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. Some sins are too heavy for that, but I need you to understand that I never intended for anyone to die. Victor Reynolds is still out there, still looking for me. He believes I know the location of the money the other crew members hid, but I was never part of their inner circle. They used me and discarded me, just like Reynolds used us all. My share is buried where only Scout knows. If Reynolds comes, trust no one but Scout and yourself. The old dog knows more than anyone realizes. I'm sorry I couldn't face you with the truth while I was alive. Take care of Scout. He's been the only family I deserved. Connor." Jack sat in the kitchen surrounded by the evidence of his brother's torment, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd inherited. Not just money and property, but a legacy of violence and guilt that stretched back decades. The words, "My share is buried where only Scout knows," echoed in his mind. Could Connor have been literal? Had he somehow trained the dog to remember the location of whatever he'd hidden? Jack looked at Scout, who lay in a patch of sunlight by the door, watching him with those intelligent eyes. "What do you know, old boy?" he asked quietly. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but he made no move to respond. That night, Jack slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images from Connor's journal, armed men in ski masks, terrified security guards, blood spreading across a bank floor. He woke before dawn, sweating and disoriented, to find Scout standing by his bedside, whining softly. The dog seemed agitated, pacing between Jack and the bedroom door as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What is it?" Jack asked, reaching for his clothes. Scout's behavior was unlike anything he'd shown in the previous days. Purposeful, insistent. He followed the dog downstairs and through the kitchen to the back door. When Jack opened it, Scout bounded outside with surprising energy for an animal his age, heading straight for the shed. On the fourth morning, Scout's behavior changed dramatically. Jack was standing behind the cabin when he noticed the dog standing rigid near the old shed, his head cocked at an angle that suggested intense concentration. The retriever's whole body quivered with suppressed energy, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not the casual sound of a dog wanting attention, but something urgent and focused. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, setting down his axe. Scout didn't acknowledge him. Instead, the dog began to pace back and forth along a section of ground behind the shed, his nose pressed close to the earth. His movements were deliberate, methodical, like a bloodhound working a scent trail. But this wasn't the casual investigation of interesting smells that Jack had observed over the past few days. This was something else entirely. The dog began to dig. At first, Jack assumed Scout had caught the scent of some small animal, a mole or ground squirrel that had made the mistake of burrowing too close to the surface. Dogs dug holes. It was what they did. But as he watched, something about the retriever's intensity made him uneasy. Scout dug with the focused desperation of an animal possessed. Dirt flew from his paws in steady streams, and he paused only to thrust his muzzle deeper into the growing hole, sniffing and whining before returning to his excavation. His arthritic joints seemed forgotten in the urgency of whatever drove him. "Easy there, old fellow," Jack said, approaching cautiously. "What's got you so worked up?" But when he knelt beside the hole and looked down, his words died in his throat. About 18 inches down, partially exposed by Scout's digging, something metallic caught the morning light. Not the dull gleam of a buried tin can or discarded tool, but the deliberate shine of manufactured metal, tarnished but unmistakably purposeful. Jack's pulse quickened. He gently moved Scout aside and began digging with his hands, brushing away loose soil with the care of an archaeologist uncovering something precious. The object was larger than he'd expected and heavier. As more of its surface became visible, he realized he was looking at a strong box, old, rusted at the corners, but intact. The box measured roughly 12 inches square and perhaps 8 inches deep. A heavy-duty padlock secured the lid, green with age but still solid. Numbers were etched into the metal near the lock, not a combination, but what looked like a serial number or inventory mark. Scout sat back on his haunches, panting heavily from his exertion, and watched Jack with those intelligent eyes. The dog's tail wagged slowly, as if he was pleased to have finally communicated something important. "How did you know?" Jack asked quietly, running his fingers along the box's corroded surface. "How did you know this was here?" The strong box felt substantial in his hands, dense with whatever it contained. He carried it into the cabin and set it on Connor's kitchen table, studying it in the better light. The metal was steel, painted black originally, but now mottled with rust and wear. The lock was substantial, not the kind of cheap hardware store variety that could be cut with bolt cutters, but serious security. In Connor's tool shed, Jack found what he needed. His brother had kept a well-organized workshop with hand tools hanging from pegboard hooks and larger equipment stored on sturdy shelves. A heavy-duty grinder with a cutting wheel made quick work of the old padlock, though Jack found himself strangely reluctant to destroy it. Something about the finality of cutting through that last barrier made him pause, but curiosity won, as it always did. The lock fell away with a metallic clang, and Jack lifted the lid, his breath caught in his chest. The box was filled with currency, not loose bills, but neat stacks of hundreds bound with rubber bands, many of which had deteriorated with age. Beneath the key, he found what looked like official documents, certificates of some kind, yellowed with time, but bearing official seals and signatures. With trembling hands, he lifted out one of the certificates. Bearer bonds, he realized after studying the formal language and elaborate printing. negotiable securities worth substantial sums, and beneath those, gold certificates, actual treasury documents that had once been redeemable for precious metal. The cash alone represented more money than Jack had seen in his lifetime, but the bonds and certificates suggested wealth on an entirely different scale. His hands shook as he counted, recounted, then gave up trying to calculate the exact total. Hundreds of thousands, certainly, possibly millions. But it was the newspaper clipping folded at the bottom of the box that made his blood run cold. The headline was from the Milford Chronicle, dated September 15, 1998. Armored car robbery leaves 2 dead, $3.2 million missing. Below that, a smaller subhead, federal investigation ongoing. Suspects remain at large. Jack sank into one of Connor's kitchen chairs, the clipping in his hands. The article described a brazen daylight robbery of an armored car making deposits at First National Bank of Milford. 2 guards, Daniel Hayes and Thomas Miller, had been killed. The perpetrators had escaped with the vehicle and its contents, abandoning it later in the mountains. Despite an extensive federal investigation, neither the money nor the criminals had ever been found. The date on the newspaper was 25 years old. The money in the strongbox matched the stolen amount exactly. His brother Connor had been involved in a robbery that left 2 men dead. Jack's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. Connor, who had read philosophy books and carved walking sticks, who had cared for an aging dog with gentle devotion, that same Connor had somehow been connected to armed robbery and murder. But even as the shock settled over him, questions began forming. If Connor had participated in the heist, why hadn't he spent the money? Why live like a hermit in a remote cabin, splitting his own firewood and growing vegetables, while millions of dollars sat buried behind his shed? And how had Scout known exactly where to dig? The dog sat near the kitchen door, watching Jack with what could only be described as expectant patience, as if waiting for him to understand something important. Those brown eyes held intelligence, yes, but also something else, a kind of knowing sadness that suggested this moment had been inevitable. Jack spread the newspaper clipping on the table, studying the accompanying photograph of the crime scene. 2 families had lost fathers that day. Federal agents had spent years trying to solve the case. And all this time, the evidence had been buried in a Montana hollow, watched over by a dog who somehow understood its significance. He thought about Sheriff Morgan's words. Connor's death wasn't as straightforward as you might have been told. Had Reynolds' men finally found his brother? Had they killed him while searching for this strongbox? And if so, why hadn't they found what they were looking for? Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine needles scratching against the cabin's windows. The sound seemed ominous now, like fingers tapping against glass, seeking entrance to secrets that had remained hidden for a quarter century. As Jack sat there surrounded by stolen money and unanswered questions, he realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The simple inheritance of a cabin and a well had transformed into something that could destroy him, or force him to confront truths about his brother that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Scout rose from his position by the door and walked slowly to Jack's chair, resting his graying head against the man's knee. The gesture felt like comfort, but also like a warning. They were in this together now, the old dog seemed to be saying. Whatever came next, they would face it as Connor would have wanted. Together. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, Jack thought he heard the sound of a vehicle engine echoing through the mountains. The engine sound Jack had heard faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the steady tick of Connor's old mantel clock. But the moment had shattered his sense of isolation, replacing it with a creeping awareness that Whisper Ridge might not be as remote as it seemed. Jack spent the rest of the night awake, one hand on the Glock, the other absently stroking Scout's head. The dog remained vigilant beside him, occasionally lifting his head to listen for sounds beyond human hearing. When dawn finally broke, Jack felt the leaden weight of exhaustion, but his mind was too wired for sleep. He made coffee, strong and black, and spread Connor's journal on the kitchen table. Now that he knew what he was looking for, details jumped out from the pages that he'd missed on first reading. Connor hadn't just been paranoid, he'd been methodical in documenting every interaction with Reynolds and his men over the years. July 12, 2021, Reynolds sent a new guy to check on me. Young, maybe 30, carries himself like ex-military but lacks discipline. Tried to pretend he was a hiker who'd lost his way, but his boots were city clean and his map was still creased from the store. He asked too many questions about whether I lived alone. I fed him the usual lies and sent him on his way. Scout tracked him for 2 miles to make sure he left the property. Reynolds is getting impatient. The journal painted a picture of a man living under constant threat, never knowing when Reynolds' people might appear, never able to fully relax his guard. But it also revealed something Jack hadn't expected. Connor had been systematically preparing for an eventual confrontation. December 3rd, 2021, finished the tunnel from the root cellar to the ridge overlook. 3 months of digging by hand, but worth the effort. If they ever corner me in the cabin, I'll have a way out they won't expect. Scout knows the route now. He's been through it enough times. Started stockpiling the supplies at exit point B. Need to reinforce the support beams in the section 3 before heavy snow. Jack looked up from the journal, his coffee forgotten and cold. A tunnel? He'd explored the property thoroughly and found no sign of any underground passage. The cabin had a root cellar beneath the kitchen, access through a trap door under the worn rug, but it was just a small storage space for preserves and root vegetables. Or so he'd thought. Setting the journal aside, Jack pulled back the rug and opened the trap door. Scout watched with interest as Jack descended the narrow steps into the cool darkness below. The cellar was perhaps 12 feet square, lined with rough shelves holding mason jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. Hanging from hooks in the ceiling were braids of garlic and dried herbs. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a root cellar for a self-sufficient cabin dweller. Jack ran his hands along the walls, looking for anything unusual. The stone was cool and damp, unremarkable. But as he examined the back wall more carefully, he noticed something odd about the mortar between the stones. In one section, it appeared fresher than the rest, slightly different in color. He pressed against various stones, feeling for any movement. Nothing happened. Then Scout descended the steps, his nails clicking on the wooden treads. The dog moved purposefully to the wall Jack had been examining and scratched at the base of it, whining softly. Jack knelt beside the dog and examined the floor where Scout was scratching. There, partially hidden beneath a stack of empty burlap sacks, he found a small metal ring embedded in the stone. When he pulled it, a section of the wall swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a dark passage beyond. "Good boy," Jack whispered, patting Scout's head. The dog wagged his tail, then trotted into the passage without hesitation, clearly familiar with the route. Jack retrieved a flashlight from his pocket and followed. The tunnel was narrow but tall enough for him to stand upright. The walls and ceiling had been reinforced with timber supports, and the floor was packed earth that had showed signs of frequent use. Scout's paw prints were visible, along with the distinctive tread of Connor's boots. The passage extended for perhaps 50 yards, sloping gradually upward before terminating at another concealed door. This one opened outward, revealing a small cave mouth that provided a perfect vantage point overlooking the cabin and surrounding clearing. The exit was concealed by thick underbrush, invisible from below unless you knew exactly where to look. Beside the exit, Jack found a weatherproof container tucked into a natural niche in the rock. Inside were basic supplies: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, ammunition, and a satellite phone that was likely dead after months without charging. Connor had created a perfect escape route and observation post, allowing him to monitor his cabin while remaining hidden. Jack sat on a fallen log, taking in the view. From here, he could see the entire property: the cabin, the shed, the overgrown garden, and all approach routes through the surrounding forest. Scout settled beside him, seemingly content to be in this familiar place. "You've been up here with Ian before, haven't you?" Jack asked. The dog looked up at him, then back toward the cabin, as if confirming the question. The strategic value of the position wasn't lost on Jack. With a rifle, Connor could have controlled the entire clearing from this vantage point. Anyone approaching the cabin would be visible long before they reached it. But the setup raised more questions. Why go to such lengths unless you were expecting serious trouble? Back in the cabin, Jack returned to the journal, reading more carefully now, looking for additional clues about Connor's preparations. What he found sent a chill down his spine. May 18th, 2022. completed the defensive perimeter. Motion sensors are solar-powered and connected to the silent alarm system. They won't know they've been detected until it's too late. Place the first set of non-lethal traps along the south approach, enough to slow them down without causing permanent damage. I'm not a killer despite what happened in Milford, but I won't be taken without a fight. Jack moved to the window, scanning the tree line with new awareness. Sure enough, once he knew what to look for, he could make out the small solar panels mounted high in the trees, cleverly disguised to look like natural growth. Connor had created an early warning system for the entire property. He continued reading, finding entries that detailed an increasingly elaborate security setup. Connor had installed pressure plates under the main approach paths, trip wires connected to noisemakers in the underbrush, and even false trails designed to lead intruders into natural dead ends, where they could be observed from hidden positions. August 30th, 2022. Reynolds called today, first direct contact in 15 years. Voice was the same, that false charm hiding cold calculation. He said he needed to tie up loose ends before retirement, said he knew I still had insurance against him, claimed he just wanted to make things right with a fair settlement. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He laughed, said his men would be in touch to help me remember. I have maybe 2 weeks before they come. Connor's final entries became increasingly urgent, describing preparations for what he clearly believed would be a final confrontation. He'd cached weapons and supplies at strategic points throughout the property. He'd established multiple fallback positions. He'd even prepared an elaborate system of booby traps that could be triggered remotely. The last entry, dated just days before his death, made Jack's blood run cold. October 12, 2023. They're coming tomorrow. Scout senses it. He always knows. I've done everything I can to prepare. The money is secure. The evidence is where only Scout can find it. If I don't survive, I hope Jack will understand when he gets here. I'm sorry, brother, for everything. Jack closed the journal, his mind racing. Connor had known they were coming for him, had prepared for it. And yet, according to Sheriff Morgan, he'd been found dead in the cabin, victim of an apparent heart attack after someone had searched the place. Had they killed him? Made it look like natural causes? And what had they been looking for? The strong box Scout had uncovered contained millions in cash and securities, but Connor's journal suggested there was more. Evidence he'd kept as insurance against Reynolds. Evidence that could connect the crime boss to the murders in Milford. Evidence worth killing for. Jack spent the rest of the day systematically exploring the property. Guided by hints from Connor's journal, behind a false panel in the gun safe, he found a leather pouch containing detailed maps of the property, with symbols marking what appeared to be defensive positions, supply caches, and escape routes. Each location was coded rather than explicitly labeled, presumably to prevent anyone else from understanding their significance. One map in particular caught his attention. It showed the cabin and surrounding area with concentric circles drawn around it, each marked with cryptic notations. Looking more closely, Jack realized it was a defensive plan, fallback positions with overlapping fields of fire, locations of prepared barricades, and what appeared to be trigger points for traps or other defensive measures. His brother hadn't just been hiding. He'd been preparing for war. In a hollow tree marked on one of the maps, Jack found a waterproof container holding more supplies, a night vision monocular, a handheld GPS unit loaded with coordinates, and a small notebook containing what appeared to be codes and frequencies. Military equipment, professional grade, not the kind of thing a civilian could easily obtain. The GPS unit contained dozens of saved waypoints scattered throughout the property and surrounding forest. Jack recognized some locations from the maps, but others were unfamiliar. He selected one of the nearest points and found it was less than 100 yards from the cabin. In a dense stand of pines he'd passed several times without noticing anything unusual. With Scout leading the way, seemingly familiar with their destination, Jack hiked to the coordinates. At first glance, there was nothing special about the location, just more pines and underbrush. But as he searched more carefully, he found a small cairn of stones that looked deliberately placed. Moving them aside revealed a metal hatch set flush with the ground, camouflaged with dirt and pine needles. The hatch opened to reveal a small underground chamber, perhaps 6 feet square, and 4 feet high. Not comfortable for standing, but adequate as a hiding place or storage cache. Inside, Jack found more supplies: food, water, medical equipment, ammunition, and a compact rifle that broke down into pieces for easy transport. Everything a person would need to survive in the wilderness for weeks. By the time Jack had explored 3 more such caches, each containing similar supplies but positioned to cover different escape routes from the property, the sun was beginning to set. He returned to the cabin, his mind struggling to process what he'd discovered. Connor hadn't just been paranoid, he'd been preparing for a specific threat with military precision. The level of planning, the attention to detail, the strategic positioning of resources, this wasn't the work of an amateur. This was how a professional prepared for an extended engagement against superior forces. That night, Jack sat by the fireplace cleaning the weapons he'd collected from various caches, methodically checking each one and familiarizing himself with their operation. Scout lay nearby, watching with apparent approval, as if he understood that Jack was continuing Connor's preparations. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the stillness shortly after midnight. Scout was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jack extinguished the lantern and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. 2 SUVs with their headlights off were approaching slowly along the access road, moving with deliberate care to minimize noise. Jack counted at least 4 men in the lead vehicle, possibly more in the second. They were dressed in dark clothing, and even at a distance, he could see they were armed. This wasn't a casual visit. This was an assault team, moving with the coordinated precision of professionals. He had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached the cabin. Not enough time to set up an effective defense, especially against unknown numbers. His military training kicked in, calculating odds and options with cold efficiency. Standing and fighting wasn't viable. Retreat and regroup was the only logical choice. "Scout," he whispered. "Time to go." The dog was already moving toward the kitchen, clearly understanding the situation. Jack grabbed his pack, already prepared with the essentials, and the rifle he'd cleaned earlier. He followed Scout into the kitchen, pulled back the rug, and opened the trap door to the root cellar. As they descended, he could hear vehicles stopping outside, doors opening quietly as men deployed around the cabin. In the root cellar, Jack activated the hidden door and followed Scout into the tunnel, pulling the door closed behind them. They moved quickly but quietly through the passage, emerging at the observation point just as the assault team breached the cabin's front door. From his elevated position, Jack could see the entire operation. 6 men in total, moving with the disciplined efficiency of military or paramilitary training. They cleared the cabin room by room, using hand signals to communicate. Professionals, not common criminals. Reynolds wasn't taking any chances this time. One man, taller than the others and carrying himself with an air of authority, directed the search from the porch. He wore an expensive leather jacket despite the cool night air, and even at a distance, there was something familiar about him. Jack raised the night vision monocular for a better look and felt his blood freeze. The man's face matched a photograph he'd seen in Connor's journal. Tommy Reynolds, Victor's nephew and second in command. The search team worked methodically through the cabin, checking every potential hiding place. They found the trap door to the root cellar within minutes and descended to investigate. Jack tensed, waiting for them to discover the tunnel, but after several minutes, the men re-emerged, apparently having missed the concealed door. Their frustration was visible even from a distance. Tommy Reynolds paced the porch, gesturing angrily as the search team reported their failure to find whatever they were looking for. Jack couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was clear enough. They'd expected to find something specific, and its absence was a problem. The search expanded to the shed and surrounding grounds. One man discovered the spot where Scout had dug up the strong box, pointing out the disturbed earth to Reynolds. The nephew's reaction was immediate and violent. He kicked a nearby bucket across the yard and grabbed the searcher by his jacket, shouting something Jack couldn't make out. Jack watched the scene unfold with growing tension. They knew about the money, had expected to find it buried where Scout had dug. Its absence confirmed what Jack had suspected. They'd killed Connor, searched the place, but failed to find what they were looking for. Now they were back, hoping Jack had led them to it. The sound of a new vehicle approaching drew everyone's attention. A sheriff's department SUV was coming up the access road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack recognized Sheriff Morgan behind the wheel. She was alone, apparently responding to a disturbance at the isolated cabin. "That's not good," Jack muttered. Morgan was driving into an ambush, outnumbered and outgunned by professionals who had already killed once to protect their secrets. Reynolds and his men reacted quickly, melting into the shadows around the cabin, taking positions that would allow them to surround the newcomer. They didn't withdraw, Jack noted. They prepared to engage. These men had no intention of avoiding a confrontation with law enforcement. Sheriff Morgan parked beside Jack's truck and emerged cautiously, one hand resting on her holstered sidearm. She surveyed the scene with professional awareness, immediately noting the signs of intrusion, the cabin door standing open, lights off, Jack's absence despite his vehicle's presence. "Mr. Sullivan," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Jack, are you here?" When no answer came, she drew her weapon and approached the cabin with measured steps, using her flashlight to illuminate the entrance. "Sheriff's Department, anyone inside, make yourself known." Jack knew he had to act. Morgan was walking into a trap, unaware of the armed men converging on her position. He couldn't warn her without revealing his location, but he couldn't sit by and watch her be ambushed either. The decision was made for him when one of Reynolds' men emerged from the shadows behind Morgan. Weapon raised, Jack fired once, the sound of his rifle echoing through the clearing. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon falling to the ground. Morgan reacted instantly, diving for cover behind her vehicle as the night erupted in gunfire. Reynolds' men opened up from multiple positions, pinning the sheriff down with a barrage that shattered her SUV's windows and punctured its tires. Jack worked the rifle's bolt, acquiring another target, a shooter using the woodpile for cover. His second shot found its mark, forcing the man to retreat. But there were too many of them, their positions too well established. Morgan was returning fire when she could, but she was hopelessly outnumbered. Scout whined urgently, nudging Jack's arm and then moving toward another path leading down from their position. Jack understood immediately. The dog knew another approach route, one that would allow them to flank Reynolds' men. They moved quickly through the underbrush, Scout leading with confidence despite the darkness. The path brought them to a position behind two of the shooters who were focused entirely on Morgan's position. Jack disabled them both with carefully placed shots to their legs, enough to take them out of the fight without killing them. The odds were evening, but Reynolds and the remaining men were adjusting their tactics, pulling back to more defensible positions around the cabin. Jack caught glimpses of them dragging their wounded to safety while maintaining covering fire. Morgan seized the opportunity to move to better cover, reaching a large pine that offered protection while allowing her to keep the cabin in view. She was a good shot, Jack noted with professional appreciation. Disciplined, conserving ammunition, making each round count. "Sheriff Morgan," Jack called out during a lull in the firing. "Northwest corner, coming in friendly." "Acknowledged," she shouted back. "Cover me while I move up." Jack provided suppressing fire as Morgan sprinted from the pine to a position nearer to him, sliding into cover behind a fallen log. Moments later, he and Scout joined her, keeping low to avoid the sporadic gunfire still coming from the cabin. "Nice of you to join the party," Morgan said, ejecting a spent magazine and slapping in a fresh one. "I came by to warn you that Reynolds' people were back in the area. Guess I was a little late." "You know about Reynolds?" Jack asked, surprised. "I know more than you think." Morgan's expression was grim in the moonlight. "Your brother and I had an understanding. I kept an eye on him, and he kept me informed about Reynolds' activities. I've been tracking that bastard for years." Another burst of gunfire interrupted their conversation, bullets thudding into the log protecting them. Reynolds and his remaining men had regrouped and were attempting to flush them out. "They're trying to flank us," Jack observed, noting the movement at the edges of the clearing. "We need to fall back to a more defensible position." Morgan nodded her agreement. "Ideas?" "Connor had this whole property rigged with defensive measures," Jack explained quickly. "There's a control system somewhere that can activate them, but I haven't found it yet." "I know where it is," Morgan said, surprising him again. "It's in the shed, hidden compartment in the workbench. But we'll need a diversion to reach it. They've got clear sight lines to the shed from their current positions." Scout whined softly, drawing their attention. The dog was looking intently toward the cabin, his body tense with alertness. Jack followed his gaze and saw a movement at the cabin's rear. Reynolds and two men were attempting to circle behind them while the remaining shooter kept them pinned with covering fire. "We're out of time," Jack said. "Scout and I will draw their attention. You make for the shed when they're focused on us." Before Morgan could protest, Jack was moving, Scout at his heels. They darted from cover to cover, drawing fire away from Morgan's position. Reynolds and his men took the bait, adjusting their focus to the new threat. Jack led them on a calculated retreat, using the terrain to his advantage, never staying in one position long enough to be flanked. Scout moved like a much younger dog, his training overcoming his physical limitations as he stayed low and kept pace with Jack. From the corner of his eye, Jack saw Morgan make her dash to the shed, reaching it unseen while Reynolds' men were occupied. Now they just needed to hold out long enough for her to activate whatever defenses Connor had prepared. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, Jack and Scout gradually falling back while keeping Reynolds' team engaged. Then, without warning, the clearing was bathed in blinding light as hidden floodlights activated around the perimeter. Simultaneously, a deafening wail erupted from speakers concealed in the trees. Not an alarm, but a disorienting cacophony designed to confuse and disorient. Reynolds' men reacted predictably, firing wildly at the lights and sounds while trying to maintain their positions. Jack seized the opportunity to move to better cover, a natural depression that offered protection while allowing him to keep the cabin in sight. The next phase of Connor's defensive system activated moments later. Small explosive charges detonated around the clearing, not powerful enough to kill, but strategically placed to create confusion and channel movement in predictable directions. Smoke canisters followed, filling the clearing with dense white clouds that reduced visibility to near zero. Jack had to admire his brother's planning. The system was perfectly designed to disorient attackers while giving defenders a crucial advantage. Connor had thought of everything, except perhaps the determination of the men who had come for him. Through the chaos, Jack caught glimpses of Reynolds shouting orders, rallying his remaining men. They were professionals, recovering quickly from their initial surprise and adapting to the changed situation. The advantage Connor's defenses had provided was already diminishing. Morgan appeared at Jack's side, breathing hard from her sprint across the clearing. "Systems activated, but it won't hold them long. We need to reach the cabin. There's more there you need to see." "Too exposed," Jack objected. "They've got it covered from multiple angles." "Not the front door," Morgan said. "Connor showed me another way in. Maintenance access to the generator room. It's on the north side, hidden behind the wood stack." Jack hesitated, weighing their options. The cabin was the most defensible position, but reaching it meant crossing open ground under fire. Still, if Morgan was right about another entrance, it might be their best chance. "Lead the way," he decided. They moved as a coordinated unit, Morgan taking point while Jack provided covering fire. Scout stayed between them, his body low to the ground, moving with the silent efficiency of a trained military animal. Jack noted the dog's behavior with growing curiosity. Scout wasn't just smart, he was displaying tactical awareness beyond what even the most well-trained civilian dog should possess. Reynolds' men spotted them halfway to the cabin and opened fire, forcing them to dive for cover behind a stack of firewood. Bullets splintered the logs inches from Jack's head as he returned fire, forcing their attackers to seek their own protection. "We're pinned," Morgan shouted over the gunfire. "Can't reach the access point from here." Scout suddenly darted away from them, racing toward the cabin in a zigzag pattern that made him a difficult target. Reynolds' men shifted their focus, trying to track the fast-moving dog, momentarily forgetting about Jack and Morgan. "Now," Jack urged, recognizing Scout's tactic for what it was, a deliberate diversion. They sprinted for the north side of the cabin, reaching the woodpile as bullets kicked up dirt at their heels. Morgan quickly located the hidden access panel, revealing a narrow passage that led beneath the cabin's foundation. "Go," Jack ordered, providing covering fire as Morgan crawled through the opening. He followed moments later, pulling the panel closed behind him just as Reynolds' men reached their previous position. The passage was tight but navigable, leading to a small room that housed the cabin's generator and electrical systems. A ladder mounted on one wall provided access to a trap door in the ceiling, an entry point directly into the cabin's kitchen. Morgan climbed first, carefully opening the trap door and scanning the kitchen before signaling Jack to follow. The cabin's interior was dark and silent, the search team having moved outside to join the firefight. "What about Scout?" Jack asked, concerned for the pea he'd last seen running as a diversion. "He knows other ways in," Morgan assured him. "Connor trained him to use all the access points." The cabin's main room showed signs of the hasty search, furniture overturned, contents of drawers dumped on the floor, books pulled from shelves. Reynolds' men had been thorough but unsuccessful in whatever they were looking for. "We don't have much time," Morgan said, moving to the fireplace. "They'll realize we're inside soon enough." She knelt by the hearth and pressed a specific stone in the masonry. A section of the flooring beneath the worn rug slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a metal case, which Morgan quickly retrieved. "Connor wanted you to have this," she explained, handing Jack the case. "Said if anything happened to him, you were the only one he trusted with it." Before Jack could respond, Scout appeared at the kitchen window, scratching insistently at the glass. Jack let him in, noticing the dog was unharmed despite his daring run across the clearing. "Good boy," he murmured, running a hand over the retriever's head. Scout pressed against his leg briefly, then moved to the front window, his posture alert, warning them of approaching danger. Jack opened the metal case while Morgan kept watch. Inside, he found a USB drive, a leather-bound notebook different from the journal he had found earlier, and several photographs. The photos showed Victor Reynolds with various individuals, some in police uniforms, others in expensive suits that suggested political or business connections. In each image, Reynolds was clearly engaged in activities that appeared illegal, exchanging briefcases, handling weapons, meeting in secluded locations. The notebook contained names, dates, transactions, a detailed accounting of Reynolds' criminal enterprise spanning decades. It was evidence, meticulously gathered and preserved. Evidence that could destroy not just Reynolds, but an entire network of corruption. Connor was gathering intelligence on Reynolds for years, Morgan explained, keeping her voice low. Tracking his operations, identifying his connections, building a case that no amount of influence could overcome. "Why?" Jack asked, "and why risk his life for this?" "Guilt," Morgan said simply. "The robbery wasn't supposed to end with 2 dead guards. Reynolds ordered the killings to eliminate witnesses, but Connor was in the car. He saw everything, couldn't stop it, spent the rest of his life trying to make it right." The sound of breaking glass from the rear of the cabin cut their conversation short. Reynolds' men had grown tired of waiting and were forcing entry. "Time to go," Morgan said, drawing her weapon. "Grab what you need. We'll use the tunnel." Jack pocketed the USB drive and several of the most damning photographs, leaving the rest in the case. As they moved towards the kitchen, a sudden crash announced the rear door giving way. Footsteps pounded through the cabin's back rooms as Reynolds' men began a room-by-room search. They reached the kitchen just as the first attacker appeared in the hallway. Morgan fired twice, forcing him back into cover. Jack upended the heavy oak table, creating a barricade as more men poured into the cabin. "Root cellar!" Morgan shouted, laying down covering fire as Jack opened the trapdoor. Scout was already moving down the steps, his body language urging them to hurry. Jack helped Morgan down the ladder, then followed as bullets splintered the wood around them. In the root cellar, he pulled the heavy trapdoor shut and slid a metal bolt into place, a reinforcement Connor had added that wouldn't stop determined attackers for long, but might buy them precious minutes. Morgan was already opening the tunnel entrance when the first impacts shook the trapdoor above. Reynolds' men were trying to break through, and from the sound of it, they had the manpower to succeed. "Go," Jack urged, pushing Morgan into the tunnel. Scout followed, and Jack brought up the rear, pulling the concealed door closed behind them. They moved quickly through the passage, hearing the splintering crash of the trapdoor giving way just as they reached the halfway point. "They'll find the tunnel entrance," Morgan said between breaths as they hurried upward. "We need to reach the observation point and keep moving." Connor had multiple escape routes mapped out. The tunnel exit was just ahead when Scout suddenly stopped, his body rigid with alarm. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared toward the opening. Jack immediately understood. Someone was waiting at the exit. Reynolds had anticipated their escape route and positioned men to intercept them. "Back," he whispered, tapping Morgan's shoulder. "We're compromised." They retreated to a wider section of the tunnel where a side passage branched off, a secondary route Jack hadn't explored during his earlier discovery. Scout led the way without hesitation, navigating the narrow passage that angled steeply upward before leveling out. This tunnel was rougher, clearly an emergency backup rather than a primary escape route. It terminated in a small chamber with what appeared to be a dead end. Scout, however, moved confidently to the ceiling, where a metal ladder was bolted to the rock. Above, Jack could make out the outline of another hatch. They climbed in silence, emerging into the cool night air inside a dense stand of pines some distance from the cabin. From their elevated position, they could see the entire clearing below. Reynolds' men swarming the property, the wounded being loaded into one of the SUVs, Tommy Reynolds himself standing on the porch shouting orders. "They're bringing in reinforcements," Morgan observed, nodding toward the access road where headlights were visible approaching the property. "Reynolds isn't taking any chances this time." "What's the plan?" Jack asked, checking his remaining ammunition. "Not nearly enough for an extended engagement against the forces gathering below." "There's a Forest Service fire road about 2 miles east of here," Morgan replied. "I've got a vehicle stashed there, part of the contingency plan Connor and I worked out. We can reach it if we move fast and stick to the high ground." Jack nodded, but a realization was forming in his mind, one that explained many of the mysteries surrounding his brother and the old dog who had led him to buried secrets. "Morgan Pye," he said slowly, "who are you really? No small-town sheriff has contingency plans with residents or stashes vehicles on fire roads." She met his gaze steadily, then reached into her pocket and produced a badge different from her sheriff's identification, Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Special Agent Rachel Morgan," she said quietly. "I've been working undercover in Whisper Ridge for 3 years, coordinating with Connor to build a RICO case against Reynolds and his organization. Your brother was my confidential informant." The revelation should have been surprising, but somehow it fit perfectly with everything Jack had discovered. Connor's military precision, his elaborate preparations, his systematic documentation. He hadn't been a paranoid survivalist. He'd been methodically gathering evidence for a federal investigation. "Connor was helping you bring down Reynolds," Jack said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why he never spent the money, why he lived like a hermit all these years." Morgan nodded. "He wanted to make amends for his role in the robbery. When I approached him 3 years ago with evidence connecting him to the case, I expected resistance. Instead, he offered to help, said he'd been waiting for a chance to make things right." "And Scout?" Jack asked, looking at the dog who sat alert beside them, watching the cabin below with focused intensity. "Special Agent Scout," Morgan said with a small smile. "Retired now, but one of the Bureau's best tracking and detection canines. Connor needed protection, and Scout needed a quiet place to live out his retirement after an injury in the field. They were a perfect match." As if understanding he was being discussed, Scout turned to look at them, his intelligent eyes reflecting the moonlight. Despite his age and arthritic joints, there was no mistaking the disciplined alertness of a highly trained working dog. "He recognized you," Jack realized. "That first day at the cabin. He knew you were FBI. Dogs never forget their training," Morgan confirmed, "or their purpose. Scout's been part of this operation from the beginning, trained to alert on specific scents, to locate hidden caches, to identify threats. Connor may have been alone in that cabin, but he was never unprotected." The sound of vehicles maneuvering below drew their attention back to the immediate threat. Reynolds had positioned his men around the property perimeter, establishing a cordon that would be difficult to penetrate. The reinforcements had arrived. 2 more SUVs disgorging armed men who move with military precision. "They're setting up a search grid," Jack observed, recognizing the tactical deployment. "They'll sweep the forest systematically until they find us." "Then we need to move," Morgan said, checking her weapon. "The evidence is what matters now. If we can get it to my team in Milford, Reynolds is finished." As they prepared to depart, Scout suddenly stiffened, his ears pricked forward as he stared intently at something on the cabin's porch. Jack followed the dog's gaze and saw Tommy Reynolds emerge, dragging a bound figure with him. "They've got a hostage," Jack said, raising the night vision monocular for a better look. The figure was male, elderly, dressed in work clothes typical of the local area. "Looks like a local, maybe someone who stumbled onto the scene." Morgan took the monocular for confirmation, then swore softly. "That's Bill Peterson, runs the general store in Whisper Ridge. Connor mentioned him in his journal, said Peterson was smart enough not to give strangers directions to isolated cabins. They're using him as bait, Jack realized as Tommy Reynolds shouted into the darkness, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Sullivan, we know you're out there. We've got the old man from the store. You've got 10 minutes to show yourself, or he starts losing fingers. To emphasize the point, one of Reynolds' men pressed a knife against Peterson's hand, drawing a pained cry from the hostage. We can't leave him, Jack said, already calculating angles and approaches. We can't risk the evidence either, Morgan countered. If Reynolds gets his hands on it, dozens of cases collapse. Years of investigation wasted. Jack weighed their options. The tactical assessment automatic after years of similar situations in combat zones. They were outnumbered, outgunned, with limited ammunition and a civilian hostage in the middle of the target zone. The logical choice was to retreat, to prioritize the evidence that could bring down Reynolds' entire organization. But logic didn't account for the terror in Peterson's eyes, visible even at this distance. It didn't account for the fact that Connor had spent 25 years trying to atone for the deaths of two men he couldn't save. And it didn't account for the fact that Jack Sullivan had spent 2 decades running from responsibilities exactly like this one. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jack's leg as if sensing his internal conflict. The dog's eyes held that same intelligent understanding Jack had noticed from their first meeting. The look of a creature who knew more than his form suggested, who carried wisdom beyond words. You take the evidence, Jack decided, handing Morgan the USB drive and photographs. Get to your vehicle, reach your team. I'll create a diversion and extract Peterson. That's suicide, Morgan objected. They've got at least a dozen men down there. I've faced worse odds, Jack replied, checking his rifle and the pistol he'd taken from one of Connor's caches. Besides, I've got the home field advantage. Connor mapped this entire property, set up defensive positions, prepared for exactly this scenario, and I've got Scout. At the sound of his name, the dog's ears perked up, his body language shifting from alert to ready, a working dog preparing for a mission. Morgan studied Jack's face, seeing the determination there. Connor said you'd do this, said when it came down to it, you'd make the same choice he would have. My brother spent 25 years trying to make amends for a mistake, Jack said quietly. I've spent 20 years running from everything that mattered. Maybe it's time I stopped running. Morgan nodded, accepting his decision. There's a weapons cache about 50 yards north of here, she said, pointing toward a lightning-struck pine visible against the skyline. Enough firepower to hold them off until I can bring in backup. I can reach my team in 90 minutes if I move fast. We'll give you 30 minutes head start, Jack said, already planning his approach. Then we'll light up the night and give Reynolds something to worry about besides searching the forest. Morgan hesitated, then pressed a small radio into his hand. Emergency frequency. My team monitors it 24/7. Use it when you're ready for extraction. She turned to leave, then paused, kneeling to stroke Scout's head one last time. Take care of him, she told the dog. He's as stubborn as his brother. Scout's tail wagged once in acknowledgement. Then Morgan was gone, moving silently through the trees toward the eastern ridge and her escape route. Jack watched until she disappeared into the darkness, then turned his attention back to the cabin below. Reynolds' men had positioned Peterson on the porch, clearly visible, with 2 guards flanking him. The rest were spreading out in search patterns, methodically covering the property perimeter. Well, Scout, Jack said quietly, looks like it's just you and me against the bad guys. Think we can handle it? The old retriever looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and for a moment Jack could almost believe the dog understood everything. The stakes, the danger, the slim chance of success. Then Scout turned and trotted purposefully toward the lightning-struck pine Morgan had indicated, pausing to look back as if asking why Jack wasn't following. All right, Jack said, a grim smile forming as he shouldered his rifle. Let's show Reynolds what happens when he messes with the Sullivan brothers. As they moved through the forest toward the weapons cache, Jack found himself thinking about Connor, not the broken, guilt-ridden man who had died alone in a remote cabin, but the brother he had once known, the boy who built forts in the woods, the young man who enlisted to serve his country, the decorated soldier who had faced danger with courage and determination. For 25 years, Connor Sullivan had been preparing for this night, gathering evidence, establishing defensive positions, creating escape routes, all while living under the shadow of past mistakes. He hadn't run from his responsibility. He had embraced it, devoted his life to it. Now it was Jack's turn to stop running, to face what came next, to make a stand for something that mattered. Scout led the way confidently through the darkness, a soldier on a final mission, guiding Jack toward the confrontation that would determine whether Connor's long vigil had been in vain, or whether justice would finally be served for crimes buried beneath 25 years of secrets. The lightning-struck pine stood stark against the night sky, its shattered top a jagged silhouette in the moonlight. Scout led Jack directly to its base, where a hollow formed by the lightning strike had been carefully enlarged and concealed. Inside, Jack found exactly what Morgan had promised, a waterproof case containing weapons and equipment that would have made a special forces team envious. 2 tactical rifles with suppressors, a compact submachine gun, 3 handguns with holsters, boxes of ammunition, flashbang and smoke grenades, body armor, night vision goggles, even a small drone with a tablet controller. Connor had prepared for war with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what he was facing. Jack quickly assembled his arsenal, selecting weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency. The body armor was top quality, lightweight ceramic plates that would stop most small arms fire. The night vision goggles were military grade, offering clear visibility in the darkened forest. Even the communications equipment was professional level, secure and reliable. As he worked, Jack's mind raced through tactical scenarios. He was outnumbered at least 10 to 1, facing professional operators in terrain they had already begun to secure. But he had advantages they didn't: intimate knowledge of the property's defenses, the element of surprise, and a furry partner who knew every inch of the battlefield. "What do you think, Scout?" Jack asked quietly as he checked the action on one of the rifles. "Ready to teach these guys a lesson?" The retriever sat alertly beside him, his aged body still carrying the disciplined posture of his training. There was something almost human in the way he watched Jack prepare, a knowing intelligence that went beyond normal canine awareness. Jack activated the tablet that controlled the drone, powering up the small aircraft and checking its systems. The screen showed a thermal imaging view of the clearing below, confirming what he already knew. Reynolds' men had established a perimeter around the cabin and were conducting an organized search of the surrounding forest. The hostage, Peterson, remained on the porch with 2 guards, while Tommy Reynolds coordinated the operation from inside the cabin. But there was something else on the tablet, an icon Jack hadn't expected. When he tapped it, the screen displayed a map of the property with dozens of markers scattered throughout the area. Each marker was labeled with a code, and a legend at the bottom explained their significance: defensive positions, trap triggers, surveillance cameras, and something labeled BD, Protocol Omega. "Your master was thorough," Jack murmured to Scout, who watched the screen with apparent understanding. Connor hadn't just prepared defenses, he'd created an integrated security system that could be controlled remotely. Jack now had access to every aspect of the property's protections. He spent several minutes studying the system, quickly grasping its capabilities. Connor had installed motion sensors throughout the property, connected to silent alarms that would alert the tablet without warning Reynolds' men. Cameras concealed in trees and rocks provided real-time visual feeds from multiple angles. And most impressively, a series of defensive measures could be triggered individually or in coordinated sequences. But it was the communications module that caught Jack's attention. A small icon labeled FBI Direct pulsed steadily in the corner of the screen. When he tapped it, a secure messaging interface opened, displaying a status indicator. "Channel active, Agent Morgan connected, response time, 28 minutes. Connor had built a direct line to his FBI handlers, completely separate from conventional communications networks. Morgan had already activated it, and help was on the way, but not for nearly half an hour. Jack would have to hold out until then while keeping Peterson alive and Reynolds contained. He tapped out a quick message. "Sullivan here, hostage situation, armed response required. Will delay and contain until arrival." The response came seconds later. "Acknowledged, tactical team deploying, ETA 28 minutes, satellite support online." The satellite support notification was unexpected, but welcome. Jack checked the tablet again and found a new option had activated: live satellite imagery of the area, updating every 30 seconds. The resolution was remarkable, showing thermal signatures of every person on the property. Reynolds' men appeared as bright heat signatures against the cooler background of the forest and buildings. "High-tech, brother, you had," Jack told Scout. "Let's see what else he left us." He explored the system further, discovering that Connor had divided the property into defensive zones, each with its own set of measures that could be activated independently. The cabin clearing, the approach road, the forest perimeter, all could be controlled separately, allowing for a coordinated defense or staged withdrawal. But it was the file labeled Protocol Omega that sent a chill down Jack's spine. When he opened it, the tablet displayed a stark warning. Protocol Omega, final option, complete property sanitization. Warning, this protocol will destroy all structures and evidence within a 300-yard radius of the cabin. Activation requires dual authentication and 120-second countdown. Irreversible once initiated. Below the warning was a simple activation interface, two buttons that would need to be pressed simultaneously, followed by a confirmation code. Connor had built a self-destruct system for the entire property, a last resort if all other options failed. Jack stared at the screen, understanding the implications. His brother had been prepared to destroy everything, the cabin, the evidence, himself, rather than let Reynolds win. It was a desperate measure, but one that made tactical sense if capture was inevitable. The question was whether Connor had ever intended to use it, or if it was simply insurance against the worst-case scenario. Scout whined softly, drawing Jack's attention back to the immediate situation. The retriever was watching the tablet screen, where one of the perimeter alerts had activated. Reynolds' men were expanding their search grid, moving closer to their position. "Time to move," Jack decided, closing the Omega file and switching back to the tactical display. "Let's see how they handle a little chaos." He studied the proper layout, identifying the optimal positions for creating diversions while working toward the cabin. The hostage was the priority, getting Peterson to safety before engaging Reynolds' forces directly. That meant drawing attention away from the cabin while positioning himself for an extraction. Jack selected several locations on the far side of the property and activated their defensive measures. Floodlights blazed to life among the trees, pointing in random directions. Speakers concealed in the underbrush began broadcasting recorded sounds, footsteps, voices, breaking branches. Small smoke charges detonated, creating confusion without revealing his actual position. The effect was immediate. On the tablet's thermal display, Jack watched as Reynolds' men reacted, several teams moving toward the disturbances while maintaining communication with their command post at the cabin. It was a professional response, but one that divided their forces, exactly what Jack needed. "Come on," he whispered to Scout, gathering his equipment. "Time to rescue an old shopkeeper." They moved silently through the forest, using the natural contours of the land for cover as they circled toward the cabin from the western approach, the direction Reynolds' men had already searched and now considered secure. Scout led with uncanny awareness, selecting paths that avoided dry leaves or brittle twigs that might betray their presence. Jack activated additional diversions as they moved, keeping Reynolds' teams off balance and confused. Each new disturbance pulled more men away from the cabin, stretching their perimeter thinner with every response. When they reached the edge of the clearing, roughly 100 yards from the cabin's rear, Jack paused to assess the situation. Peterson remained on the porch, guarded by two men with automatic weapons. Tommy Reynolds was visible through the cabin windows, coordinating his search teams via radio. Three more men patrolled the immediate perimeter of the clearing, maintaining a loose cordon around the building. The odds were improving, but still challenging. Jack would need to neutralize the perimeter guards silently, then create a diversion substantial enough to draw the porch guards away from Peterson long enough for an extraction, and he'd need to do it all without exposing himself to Tommy Reynolds' direct line of sight. Scout nudged his hand, then looked meaningfully toward a dense stand of pines about 30 yards to their right. Jack followed the dog's gaze and noticed a small metal box attached to the base of the largest tree, another of Connor's installations, not marked on the tablet's map. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Jack reached the box and found it secured with a combination lock. He hesitated, uncertain of the code, until Scout scratched at the ground near his feet. Looking down, Jack noticed markings carved into an exposed root, 6 digits that might be the combination. The lock opened on the first try, revealing a control panel similar to but distinct from the tablet interface. This system was hardwired, connected to the cabin and surrounding area by concealed cables. It offered direct control of the cabin's security measures without relying on wireless signals that might be detected or jammed. Among the options was one labeled Extraction Protocol C with a simple activation switch. Jack didn't know what it would do, but the label suggested it was designed for precisely this kind of situation. He checked his watch, still 20 minutes before FBI reinforcements would arrive. Peterson didn't have that long. Jack made his decision. He positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the porch, readied his rifle, and flipped the switch. The response was immediate and coordinated. The cabin's generator exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the building and surrounding area into darkness. Simultaneously, the water pipes beneath the structure ruptured, sending a geyser of pressurized water through the floorboards and creating instant confusion inside. Most importantly, the porch itself separated from the main structure with a groan of protesting wood, tilting at a steep angle that sent the 2 guards stumbling for balance, while Peterson, who had been seated, simply rolled into the protective shadow of the steps. Jack didn't hesitate. As the guards struggled to regain their footing, he fired twice, taking them down with non-lethal shots to their legs. Then he was moving, sprinting across the clearing toward Peterson while Scout raced ahead, reaching the old shopkeeper first and tugging him toward better cover. Shouts of alarm erupted from inside the cabin as Tommy Reynolds and his remaining men realized what was happening. Gunfire erupted from the windows, but it was uncoordinated and inaccurate in the sudden darkness. Jack reached Peterson, finding the old man terrified but unharmed. "Stay low," he instructed, cutting the zip ties binding the shopkeeper's wrists. "Follow the dog. He'll lead you to safety." Scout was already moving, guiding Peterson toward the forest edge where Jack had prepared a fallback position. Jack provided covering fire, forcing Reynolds' men to keep their heads down as the hostage made his escape. The extraction had taken less than 30 seconds, but it had also revealed Jack's presence. Tommy Reynolds had seen him now, and the full force of his operation would be redirected to this new threat. "Sullivan!" Tommy's voice bellowed from the cabin. "You're dead, you hear me? Dead!" Jack didn't bother responding. He was already moving to his next position, putting distance between himself and Peterson while maintaining pressure on the cabin. The tablet showed the search teams converging on the clearing, abandoning their previous grid pattern to respond to the new threat. Scout reappeared at his side as Jack reached the cover of a large boulder. The retriever's mission accomplished, he had returned for the next phase of the operation. "Good boy," Jack murmured, checking the tablet for updates. Peterson's heat signature was moving steadily away from the danger zone, following a path that would eventually lead him to the Forest Service road where help would arrive. One less civilian to worry about. Now Jack could focus on containing Reynolds until the FBI arrived. He activated another set of defensive measures, this time targeting the approach routes the search teams would use to return to the cabin. Flashbang grenades detonated among the trees, disorienting the men and slowing their advance. Smoke canisters followed, reducing visibility to near zero in key corridors. The tablet's communication module chimed with an incoming message. "Sullivan, update status, Team ETA 15 minutes. Jack replied quickly, "Hostage secure, containing target at cabin. Multiple hostiles heavily armed." "Understood. Satellite shows 16 heat signatures remaining on property. Air support authorized." Air support was a significant escalation, but one Jack welcomed. Helicopter backup would dramatically change the tactical situation, especially if it arrived with the FBI ground team. He checked his ammunition and prepared for the next phase. Reynolds' men would regroup quickly, establishing a defensive perimeter around the cabin while sending teams to hunt for Jack. He needed to keep them off balance, prevent them from organizing an effective response before reinforcements arrived. Jack was about to activate another diversion when Scout suddenly growled, his attention fixed on the cabin. Through the night vision goggles, Jack saw what had alarmed the dog. A new vehicle was approaching along the access road, larger than the SUVs Reynolds' teams had arrived in. A black Suburban with tinted windows, moving with deliberate purpose toward the cabin. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the clearing, and a single figure emerged. Older, distinguished, carrying himself with the confidence of absolute authority. Even at a distance, there was something coldly calculating in his movements, something that set him apart from his hired muscle. Victor Reynolds had arrived personally. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The crime boss's presence changed everything. This was no longer just a recovery operation for stolen money. It was a direct intervention by the head of the organization. Reynolds wouldn't be here unless the stakes were extraordinarily high. Through the rifle scope, Jack studied the man who had haunted his brother's life for 25 years. Reynolds was in his 70s now, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in what appeared to be a tailored suit beneath a cashmere overcoat. He moved with the slight stiffness of age but carried himself with unmistakable authority. When he spoke to his nephew, Tommy's body language instantly became deferential, almost fearful. Jack couldn't hear their conversation, but the effect was immediate. The chaotic response to his attack shifted to something more organized and deliberate. Reynolds was taking personal command, and his men were responding with increased discipline. On the tablet, Jack watched as the search teams reformed into tactical units, establishing a coordinated perimeter while maintaining communications discipline. These weren't just hired guns anymore. They were operating like a military unit under experienced command. Jack messaged the FBI team. Victor Reynolds on site. Repeat, primary target confirmed on property. The response was immediate. Understood. Priority upgrade authorized. Additional assets deploying. Maintain surveillance. Do not engage primary target directly. The warning was unnecessary. Jack had no intention of confronting Reynolds directly, not when justice was just minutes away. His job now was to contain the situation. Keep Reynolds at the cabin until the FBI arrived to make their arrest. But Reynolds had other plans. After a brief conference with Tommy, he returned to his Suburban, apparently preparing to depart. He was cutting his losses, leaving his nephew and hired men to deal with the situation while he escaped with whatever information they had managed to recover. Jack couldn't allow that. If Reynolds left now, he might disappear again, using his considerable resources to evade justice as he had for 25 years. This was their one chance to capture him, to finally close the case that had consumed Connor's life. The FBI was still 10 minutes out, too long to wait. Jack had to act now. He activated the property's entrance defenses, triggering a series of small explosives that collapsed a section of the access road behind Reynolds' vehicle. The Suburban's driver immediately attempted to reverse, but found his escape route blocked by the fallen trees and displaced earth. Reynolds emerged from the vehicle, his composure finally cracking as he shouted orders at his men. They scrambled to create an alternative exit, using the SUVs to begin clearing a path through the forest beside the blocked road. Jack messaged the FBI again. Target attempting escape, road blocked, request immediate air support. Air assets 5 minutes out, ground team redirecting to block forest exit routes. 5 minutes might be too long. Reynolds' men were working efficiently, creating a rough but passable path that would allow the Suburban to bypass the blocked road. Jack needed to slow them down further. He activated more defensive measures, targeting the area where the men were working. Smoke canisters deployed, filling the area with dense white clouds that reduced visibility to zero. The work stopped momentarily as the men sought to identify the source of the smoke. But Reynolds was adapting quickly. He directed his teams to establish a security perimeter around the clearing while the work continued. Men with automatic weapons took up positions facing outward, prepared to engage any threat that emerged from the forest. Jack recognized the tactical shift with professional respect. Reynolds might be a criminal, but he understood battlefield control. He was creating a defensible position while preparing his escape, minimizing his vulnerability while maximizing his options. The tablet chimed with another message. Sullivan, satellite shows new development at your location. Unknown device activated in cabin basement. Jack switched to the property's surveillance feeds, accessing a camera Connor had installed in the cabin's foundation. The image was grainy but clear enough to show what Reynolds' men were doing. They had located something in the root cellar and were attaching what appeared to be explosive charges to the foundation walls. They weren't just planning to escape, they were preparing to destroy the cabin and any evidence it contained. But why use explosives when they could simply burn it down? Unless the realization hit Jack with sudden clarity. Reynolds knew about Protocol Omega. Somehow he had learned about Connor's last resort option and was attempting to trigger it himself, not just destroying the cabin, but obliterating the entire property and anyone on it. It would eliminate Jack, destroy all the evidence, and could be dismissed as a tragic accident or the desperate act of a cornered fugitive. Scout growled softly, sensing Jack's tension. The retriever's eyes reflected the same understanding. They had minutes at most, before Reynolds' men completed their work. Jack studied the tablet, looking for options. The Protocol Omega file had mentioned dual authentication, two separate activation points that would need to be triggered simultaneously. Reynolds' men had found one in the root cellar, but where was the second? He scrolled through the property maps, looking for anything Connor might have marked as a critical system. There, on the eastern edge of the clearing, a small structure labeled Primary Control Junction. It had to be the second activation point. Jack messaged the FBI team. Reynolds attempting to trigger self-destruct system. Need immediate intervention. Understood. Air support 3 minutes out. Ground team 7 minutes. Too long. Jack would have to handle this himself. Scout, he said quietly. We need to move. Now. The dog was already on his feet, alert and ready. They moved quickly but carefully through the forest, circling around to approach the cabin from the east, while avoiding the security perimeter Reynolds had established. Through the rifle scope, Jack could see Reynolds standing beside his Suburban, watching impassively as his men worked. The crime boss's face was expressionless, showing neither anger nor concern, just cold calculation as he prepared to eliminate all traces of his presence. Jack reached the small structure Connor had marked as the control junction. It was disguised as a tool shed, weathered and unremarkable, but the lock on the door was new and substantial. He didn't have time to search for a key or a combination. Stand back, he told Scout, then fired a single shot into the lock mechanism. The door swung open, revealing a sophisticated control panel similar to the one he'd found earlier. This system, however, was clearly more critical, hardened against tampering and requiring biometric authentication. A handprint scanner glowed softly in the dim interior, waiting for authorized access. Jack hesitated, uncertain whether his palm would work or if the system had been keyed exclusively to Connor. But Connor had left everything else for Jack to find. Surely he would have considered this possibility as well. Taking a deep breath, Jack pressed his palm against the scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flashed green and a mechanical voice announced, "Sullivan DNA signature confirmed. Genetic profile match acceptable. Access granted." Connor had programmed the system to recognize his brother's DNA, similar enough to his own to pass the security check. The control panel activated, displaying a status screen that confirmed Jack's fears. The Protocol Omega countdown had been initiated from the root cellar access point. All that remained was confirmation from this terminal to begin the irreversible sequence. Jack quickly disabled the authentication protocol, ensuring that Reynolds' men couldn't complete the activation, even if they found this location. But the tablet was showing another problem. They had planted enough explosives in the root cellar to collapse the cabin regardless of whether Protocol Omega activated. They were preparing to detonate manually. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the mountains, growing louder by the second. The FBI air support was almost here, but Reynolds' men were moving with increased urgency, aware that their window for escape was closing. Jack messaged the FBI team. Explosives in cabin, immediate threat to evidence and structure. Understood. Air team authorized for immediate intervention. Snipers deploying. Through the rifle scope, Jack watched as Reynolds conferred with his nephew one last time, then moved toward his Suburban, clearly intending to attempt the escape route through the forest despite the rough terrain. Tommy Reynolds remained by the cabin, apparently tasked with ensuring the explosives detonated after his uncle was safely away. Jack had to make a choice. The helicopter was still a minute out. The explosives could detonate at any moment. He could either attempt to neutralize Tommy and prevent the detonation, or he could stop Victor Reynolds from escaping. He couldn't do both. Scout made the decision for him. The retriever nudged his arm, then looked pointedly toward Victor Reynolds. The message was clear. The crime boss was the priority. Connor had spent 25 years gathering evidence against him. Letting him escape now would render that sacrifice meaningless. Jack took up position with a clear line of sight to Reynolds' Suburban. The distance was substantial, nearly 300 yards across the clearing, but the rifle Connor had left was precision-built for exactly this kind of shot. Jack calculated the variables automatically: distance, wind speed, bullet drop. Then he took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the Suburban's engine block, precisely where Jack had aimed. Steam erupted from the punctured radiator, and the vehicle shuddered to a halt. Reynolds' driver immediately tried to restart it, but the damage was done. The Suburban was disabled. Reynolds emerged from the vehicle, fury finally breaking through his composed exterior. He shouted orders at his men, pointing toward the forest, directing them to bring another vehicle. But it was too late. The FBI helicopter crested the ridge, powerful searchlights illuminating the clearing and transforming night into day. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Federal agents, this property is surrounded. Drop your weapons and lie face down on the ground." Reynolds' men reacted with professional discipline, immediately taking up defensive positions and opening fire on the helicopter. The aircraft banked sharply, evading the worst of the gunfire while maintaining its spotlight on the clearing. In the chaos, Victor Reynolds made his move, sprinting toward the forest edge with surprising speed for a man his age. He was heading directly for one of the supply caches Jack had discovered earlier. Whether by knowledge or coincidence, he was running toward a potential escape route. Jack tracked him through the rifle scope, calculating another shot. Non-lethal this time, a wound that would stop him without killing him. Justice required Reynolds to stand trial for his crimes, not die anonymously in a Montana forest. Before Jack could fire, Scout barked sharply, a warning. Jack looked up from the scope to see Tommy Reynolds and two men approaching his position, having spotted him during the confusion. They were less than 50 yards away and closing fast. Jack swung the rifle toward the new threat, firing twice and dropping one of the men with a shoulder wound. The others took cover, returning fire with automatic weapons that sent bullets cracking through the trees around him. He was pinned down, unable to pursue Victor Reynolds or effectively engage Tommy's team. The old crime boss was disappearing into the forest, escaping justice yet again. Then a new sound joined the chaos. Multiple vehicles approaching rapidly along the Forest Service Road. The FBI ground team had arrived ahead of schedule, blocking the eastern escape routes. More spotlights swept the forest as agents deployed in tactical formation. On the tablet, Jack could see Victor Reynolds' heat signature stop abruptly as he encountered the FBI perimeter. The crime boss turned, seeking another escape route, but found himself surrounded. For the first time in 25 years, Reynolds had nowhere to run. Tommy Reynolds and his remaining men realized their situation was deteriorating rapidly. They abandoned their attack on Jack's position and fell back toward the cabin, apparently intending to make a final stand or possibly trigger the explosives as a last act of defiance. Jack couldn't allow that. Too much evidence would be lost if the cabin was destroyed. He messaged the FBI team. "Explosives in cabin root cellar. Hostile force retreating to that position. Acknowledged. Tactical team moving to intercept." But the FBI agents were still establishing their perimeter. They wouldn't reach the cabin in time to prevent the detonation. Jack made his decision. He moved quickly through the forest, circling to approach the cabin from the rear, while Tommy and his men focused on the FBI forces visible at the property's edge. Scout stayed close, moving with the silent efficiency that belied his age and physical limitations. They reached the cabin's back entrance as Tommy and three remaining men entered through the front. Jack could hear them inside, arguing about their next move. Time was running out. Jack activated the final defensive measure Connor had installed: emergency lockdown. Steel shutters slammed down over all windows and doors, triggered by controls on the tablet. Tommy and his men were trapped inside, unable to escape, but also unable to detonate the explosives immediately. The FBI tactical team reached the cabin moments later, establishing a perimeter and calling for surrender. Jack emerged from cover, identifying himself to prevent friendly fire. "Sullivan?" The tactical team leader approached, weapon lowered but ready. "Agent Morgan said you'd be here. What's the situation?" "4 hostiles inside, armed and desperate. Explosives in the root cellar, possibly on a timer. Victor Reynolds is somewhere on the eastern perimeter, probably already in custody." The team leader nodded, then spoke into his radio, confirming the situation and requesting additional resources. We'll handle it from here. You've done enough. But Jack wasn't finished. There's another way in, he said. A maintenance access on the north side. I can lead a team in behind them, neutralize the threat before they can detonate anything. The team leader hesitated, then nodded sharply. Show us. Jack led a four-man entry team to the hidden access point, the same one he and Morgan had used earlier. They moved silently into the generator room beneath the cabin, then up into the kitchen while Scout kept watch outside. They could hear Tommy Reynolds and his men in the main room arguing about whether to surrender or make a final stand. The explosives were visible against the far wall, enough C4 to level the cabin and everything in it. The FBI team moved with practiced efficiency, deploying flashbang grenades before storming the room. The operation was textbook perfect. Tommy and his men were disoriented and subdued before they could reach for weapons or detonators. As the agents secured the prisoners, Jack examined the explosives. They had been hastily placed but effectively wired. A timer showed less than 2 minutes remaining, cutting it closer than he'd realized. With the FBI explosives expert, Jack carefully disconnected the detonator, rendering the charges harmless. The evidence Connor had spent 25 years gathering was finally secure. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. FBI evidence response teams, additional tactical units, even medical personnel. The property was now the center of a major federal operation. Jack found Scout waiting patiently by the porch steps, somehow untouched by the chaos around him. The old retriever's mission was complete. He had helped bring Victor Reynolds to justice, just as Connor had trained him to do. As Jack knelt beside the dog, a familiar voice called his name. Morgan approached, her FBI windbreaker replacing the sheriff's uniform she'd worn earlier. We got him, she said simply. Victor Reynolds is in custody. So is Tommy and most of their organization. It's over, Jack. The words should have brought relief, but Jack felt strangely hollow. Connor should have been here to see it. He was, Morgan said softly, nodding toward Scout. In a way. The dog's eyes seemed to confirm her words, carrying that same knowing intelligence that had guided Jack through the night's events. Connor's final mission, completed through his loyal companion. As FBI agents swarmed the property, cataloging evidence and securing prisoners, Jack noticed Scout had grown unusually still. The dog's breathing was labored, his body trembling slightly despite the mild night air. Scout? Jack knelt beside him, concern mounting as he recognized the symptoms. The stress and exertion of the night had been too much for the old dog's damaged heart. The medication Connor had been giving him could only compensate for so much. Morgan saw it too. We need a medic here, she called, her voice sharp with urgency. Scout collapsed against Jack's leg, his eyes still alert but his body failing. The medics arrived quickly, examining the dog with professional efficiency. He needs immediate veterinary care, one reported. There's a clinic in Milford that works with our K9 units. We can have him there in 20 minutes by helicopter. Jack lifted Scout carefully, cradling the old retriever as they moved toward the waiting helicopter. Hang in there, boy, he murmured. Your job's done now. Time to rest. Scout's tail thumped weakly against Jack's arm, acknowledging the words even as his strength faded. The helicopter flight to Milford passed in a blur of worry and adrenaline crash. Jack stayed beside Scout, one hand resting on the dog's head, providing what comfort he could as the medical team monitored his vital signs. At the veterinary clinic, a team was waiting, alerted by the FBI to prepare for an emergency. They whisked Scout away to surgery, leaving Jack in a sterile waiting room with nothing but his thoughts and the blood drying on his clothes. Morgan joined him an hour later, bringing coffee and news. Reynolds is talking, she said, sitting beside him, trying to cut a deal. His organization is falling apart. We've made arrests in 6 states based on the evidence Connor gathered. Jack nodded absently, his mind still with Scout in the operating room beyond. The families of Hayes and Miller will finally have closure, Morgan continued, and the money from the strongbox will be returned to them, with interest. Connor would have wanted that. He spent his whole life trying to make it right, Jack said quietly. Was it worth it? Ask yourself this, Morgan replied. 2 men died in that robbery. Their families have spent 25 years without justice, without closure. Connor gave up everything to change that. Is justice worth a lifetime of sacrifice? I don't know. I don't. But Connor thought it was, and now those families will finally have answers. The veterinarian emerged from the surgical suite, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Sullivan, Scout is stable, but his condition is serious. The strain on his heart was significant, and there's been some damage to the muscle tissue. We've repaired what we could, but at his age, with his existing conditions. Will he recover? Jack asked directly. Partially, the vet replied honestly. He'll never regain full function, and he'll need medication and monitoring for the rest of his life. But with proper care, he could have another year or two of reasonable quality of life. Jack felt relief wash over him. A year or two wasn't much, but for a Mao who had already given so much, it was something. Time to rest, to be simply a Mao rather than an agent on an endless mission. When can I take him home? The question surprised him as much as the vet. Home. He hadn't used that word in 20 years, hadn't had a place that qualified since Sarah died. A few days for initial recovery, the vet said. Then he'll need a quiet place to recuperate, with someone who can monitor his medication schedule. He'll have it, Jack promised. 3 days later, Jack drove Scout back to the cabin at Whisper Ridge. The property had been released by the FBI after their evidence teams had thoroughly documented everything. The cabin itself was surprisingly intact, despite the night's violence. Connor's construction had been solid, built to last through whatever came. Jack carried Scout inside, settling him on a blanket near the fireplace. The old dog looked around the familiar space, then sighed contentedly, his mission complete at last. Morgan arrived that afternoon, bringing supplies and news. The case against Reynolds was proceeding rapidly, with multiple indictments already filed. The evidence Connor had gathered was proving decisive, implicating not just Reynolds but dozens of associates in crimes spanning decades. The prosecutors are calling it one of the most significant organized crime cases in Montana history, she told Jack as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. All because one man refused to let go of his guilt. Or his sense of justice, Jack amended. The U.S. attorney wants to meet you, Morgan continued. Your testimony about the events here will be crucial to several cases. And there's the matter of the reward. Reward? There was a standing reward for information leading to Reynolds' capture, $500,000. As the person who provided the final assistance that led to his arrest, it's legally yours. Jack shook his head. It should go to the families, Hayes and Miller. They're the ones who lost everything. Connor would have said the same thing, Morgan observed with a small smile. You brothers are more alike than you probably realize. Inside, Scout woofed softly, drawing their attention. The dog was sitting up, watching them through the window with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. What will you do now? Morgan asked. After the trials, the testimony, when it's all finished. Jack looked around at the cabin, the forest, the mountains that had sheltered his brother's secret life for so many years. I think I'll stay, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Fix up the place. Take care of Scout. Maybe find out what Connor saw in all this solitude. It gets lonely up here, Morgan said, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken question. I've been alone for 20 years, Jack replied. But I'm starting to think there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Morgan's hand found his on the porch railing, a brief touch that carried potential. Whisper Ridge isn't that far from the field office in Milford. I'll be working the Reynolds case for months. Might need to check in regularly. Scout would like that, Jack said with a small smile. He's grown attached to you. Just Scout? Her eyes held his, the professional agent momentarily set aside. We'll see, Jack answered, but the warmth in his voice belied the non-committal words. Inside, Scout had fallen asleep by the fireplace, his mission complete, his loyalty rewarded with peace at last. Jack watched the old dog through the window, thinking about the strange paths that had led them both to this moment. A broken man and an aging retriever, finding purpose in the legacy of a brother who had spent his life seeking redemption. 6 months later, Jack stood in a federal courthouse in Helena, watching as Victor Reynolds received his sentence, multiple life terms without possibility of parole. The crime boss showed no emotion as the judge read the verdict, his composure maintained even in defeat. But Jack noticed the slight tremor in Reynolds's hands, the only outward sign that his empire had crumbled around him. The families of Hayes and Miller were present, finally witnessing justice for their loved ones after 25 years. Jack had met with them privately before the trial, explaining Connor's role in both the crime and its eventual resolution. They had listened silently, their grief still evident, but tempered now with understanding. The money from the strongbox had been returned to them, along with Jack's portion of the reward. It wouldn't bring back their husbands and fathers, but it acknowledged the debt that had remained unpaid for too long. Morgan stood beside Jack as they left the courthouse, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the months of investigation and preparation. Her position with the FBI kept her busy, but she had found reasons to visit Whisper Ridge with increasing frequency as the case progressed. "It's finally over," she said as they walked to the car. "Connor can rest now." Jack nodded, thinking of the small marker he had placed on the ridge overlooking the cabin. Not a formal grave, but a memorial to the brother who had sacrificed everything to make things right. He'd be satisfied. Justice was all he wanted in the end. "And what do you want, Jack Sullivan?" Morgan asked, stopping to face him directly. Jack considered the question. 6 months ago, he had been a drifter with no purpose beyond making it to the next day, the next town, the next temporary job. Now he had a home, a purpose, and possibilities he was only beginning to explore. "I want to stop running," he said finally. "I've spent 20 years trying to outrun grief and guilt and responsibility. Maybe it's time to stand still for a while, see what grows when you put down roots." Morgan's smile carried understanding and something more, a shared recognition of how quickly life could change when you stopped running from the past and started building a future. At the cabin, Scout greeted them from his favorite spot on the porch, moving slowly but steadily down the steps to welcome them home. The old retriever's health had stabilized with proper care and medication, giving him comfort in his retirement. He spent his days dozing in patches of sunlight or accompanying Jack on short walks around the property, his service complete, but his companionship still vital. Jack had renovated the cabin over the months, repairing the damage from the firefight and making improvements Connor had probably intended but never completed. The boarded windows now held clear glass, the sagging porch had been rebuilt, and the garden had been restored to productivity. Solar panels provided reliable power, and a satellite dish offered connection to the outside world when needed. But the most important changes weren't physical. Jack had found purpose in continuing Connor's work, not hunting criminals, but supporting the families affected by them. He had established a foundation using the reward money, providing assistance to the families of victims of violent crimes. It wasn't atonement exactly, but it acknowledged the ripple effects of violence that continued long after the headlines faded. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Scout dozing at their feet, Jack felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Sarah's death. The cabin wasn't just his brother's legacy now. It had become a place of healing, of new beginnings built on the foundation of the past. "I found something in Connor's papers," Morgan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "A letter he wrote to you years ago but never sent. It was mixed in with the evidence files." She handed him an envelope, yellowed with age but unopened. Jack recognized his brother's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message brief but profound. "Jack, if you're reading this, then somehow the truth found its way to you. I've spent 25 years trying to balance the scales for 2 men who died because of my mistakes. I don't know if justice is ever truly possible in this world, but I believe the attempt matters. The money is tainted, but what you do with it doesn't have to be. Find your own path to making things right. It's never too late to stop running. Your brother, Connor." Jack folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Connor had understood somehow that Jack would eventually find his way to Whisper Ridge, that their parallel journeys would eventually converge. Even in death, his brother had found a way to offer guidance. Scout stirred at Jack's feet, looking up with those knowing eyes that had seen so much. The old retriever had been Connor's conscience, his companion through long years of isolation and purpose. Now he was Jack's link to that legacy, a living reminder that redemption came in many forms. Morgan's hand found Jack's again, a quiet affirmation of presence and possibility. Below them, the lights of Whisper Ridge appeared one by one, A darkness settled over the valley, small beacons of civilization in the wilderness. Not so isolated after all, Jack realized. Just far enough away to gain perspective. What happens now? Morgan asked softly. Jack looked at the mountains, the forest, the cabin that had sheltered so many secrets, and now offered a future he hadn't imagined possible. Now, he said, we live. Scout's tail thumped once against the porch boards, approving the simplicity and truth of the answer. Some folks say a man can lose everything and still find his way back. Jack Sullivan had discovered that the path forward sometimes required returning to where you began, seeing with new eyes what had been there all along. The gold band on his finger caught the last light of day. He would always carry Sarah with him, just as he would carry the memory of Connor and the lessons learned in this remote corner of Montana. But for the first time in 20 years, Jack wasn't looking back at what he had lost. He was looking forward to what he might build from the ashes of the past. Redemption, he had learned, wasn't a destination but a journey, one that continued long after the original debt had been paid.